So this is the main new feature on the Galaxy Z Flip 5. This is the cover display. It's a 3.4-inch 720p AMOLED display, and while the specs don't seem that impressive, the functionality of this cover display is leaps and bounds beyond anything we've ever seen on a Z Flip before. While of course the headlighting feature is that, well, just look at it. It's way bigger than any cover screen we've ever had before. But of course, the functionality of it has changed. And when you go over to notifications, you can see that your notifications appear bigger when you actually click on them. And when you click on an email notification, for example, you can actually read a lot of the email without having it being compromised because of the size of the display. Then you go into quick settings, you have way more functionality here. Wi-Fi, sound, Bluetooth, all that is still here. Airplane mode, different focus modes for Android, I guess. And when you go into your widgets, you can now control the cover screen in a whole different way by using your fingers as gestures. It's really cool. And of course your widgets are larger, especially with the weather widget. You can actually kind of see more stats and stuff. Really cool. Thank you so much for that, Samsung. And of course you have your calls, but the one thing I want to get to is the apps. The apps on this cover display, well, you can run any app you want. The default apps they give you are Maps, Messages, Netflix, WhatsApp, and YouTube. But if you use Good Lock, if you go to the Galaxy Store and download Good Lock, you can unlock way more functionality. As you can see here, I have my own sort of Good Lock launcher on here. I have the apps I like to use in the cover display. But you can add as many apps as you want to. They're not going to be as optimized as the 5 apps that Samsung gives you, but you do have the option and it is there. Besides the cover display, you will also find the cameras on the front of the phone. I mean, at least the 2 back cameras. So you have your 12 megapixel ultra wide and your 12 megapixel main camera. Of course, these sensors are practically unchanged from last year with slight bumps to sensor size, but in terms of megapixel, f-stop count, they're exactly the same. And I'm kind of disappointed here, Samsung. Compared to other fold phones like the N3 Flip that just came out from Oppo, as well as probably the upcoming OnePlus Flips and the new Moto Razrs, this is severely, severely underhanded. Just look at the size of these sensors. Even with the specs, you can just tell these cameras are just going to be less superior than others in the space. I mean, they're downright tiny. In fact, the specs from this Z Flip 5 compare more to the S20 from 3 years ago than it does to modern smartphones of today. And while, yes, I get the fact that you can't really cram a 108 megapixel sensor into this small folding design, I think the cameras on this phone are due for an upgrade. It definitely does show in the quality of the pictures. In bright daylight, you'll probably be fine. Most phones can take good photos in bright daylight anyway. But once you step into the dark or any lower light scenes, you can clearly see that the smaller sensor sizes on here, as well as the lowered megapixel count, definitely have a hit on low light performance. And if you're not Google, you can't really pull off A+ level camera performance in the dark without decent or above average quality sensors. Here's some examples if you guys want to take a look. Under the hood of the Z Flip 5, we have probably some of the most impressive specs you will find on a smartphone today. Of course, you have that Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, you have 8 gigs of RAM, and on my model, I have 512 gigabytes of storage. This is the epitome of a flagship phone. That's just how every flagship phone is going to be these days. And for $99, that is kind of what we all expect from Samsung. I mean, there's not really much to talk about here. Other than the chip in here, the 8 Gen 2 is made for Galaxy, so I guess it's a little more efficient, a little more higher clocked. But other than that, again, it's the same formula that you see through the rest of the slab phone market. I mean, the S23 Ultra rocks these specs. The OnePlus Open rocks these specs. It's not a very unique spec list, to say the least. And then again, that's just not what this phone is about. This is what the phone is about, the functionality of actually folding it. So let's get into that. How can you use this phone to its best potential? So the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 in here drives a 6.7 inch 1080p display, 425 ppi. So it's not necessarily the most pixel dense display in the world. It's not 500 plus, but it's not too shabby either. And with this very tall and skinny 22:9 aspect ratio, it is pretty thin to say the least. It's very great ergonomically, very easy to grip in the hand. To be fair, I do have big hands, but even for a normal sized person, still really ergonomic to use. Again, really tiny hole punch at the front, very basic screen, but again, this screen does fold, and the functionality that comes with that is, well, way better multitasking for a phone that's not a booklet style fold like a Z Fold 4 or the OnePlus Open. If you use the sidebar, what you can do is you can preset apps. So for me, I have YouTube and X or Twitter like customized, right? So if I want to watch a video, let's say, I can just prop it up right here, let's put on this, right? And I can just scroll as much as I want. And if I want to prop it up, I can do that too. I can do that while watching a video. This is something you just can't do on any other regular phone. It's not happening. Obviously, you can probably get this multitasking configuration on a slab phone like the S23 Ultra, but you're not getting the literal flexibility of propping up like a stand if you just want to go hands-free and just use the phone. Just use it without having to hold it or grasp it or anything like that. And that freedom is just kind of nice. And if anything does happen to the phone while it's there, let's say you spill a drink on it, for example, the IPX8 water resistance will probably do just fine of a job keeping it nice and safe. And if you want to go even deeper into multitasking, Samsung does have a settings area called Labs, where you can customize to your heart's content just a ton of really deep power user settings that are in here that just make the user experience of this phone even richer than what it already is. And the design of this phone isn't too shabby either. I mean, it's a very rounded off phone, so it's not very sharp and jagged to hold in the hand. Very shiny aluminum rails. And on the back you have glossy glass this year. If you want, you'd have to buy a Samsung.com exclusive to get matte glass, so not the best combination. And on the front, I mean, the bezels on the outside display are kind of thick, but at the same time, it's an outside display. It's as big can get. And on the inside, well, the bezels, again, have to be slightly bigger than other phones, simply because of the fact that, well, when you close it, you need a barrier. And the overall design of this phone is not that unique, but at the same time, it looks good. It's not an ugly phone to look at, to be fair. And the design of this phone, again, is headed by that folding functionality. Okay, let's be honest here. The very, very small 3700 milliamp hour cell in this phone is not gonna give you great battery life. For me, it gave me about 4 hours of screen on time with very high social media and video use. Basically, the lightest way you can tax a phone. And if you do go into more intensive tasks, such as using the camera, video editing, or even gaming, especially on the cover display, it's really fun. You will definitely experience less and less screen on time from that 4 hour mark. And I'm pretty disappointed in Samsung for this because I really wanted this to be like a slab phone, but just condensed. But we just can't have that yet. The fact that the phone folds like this forces you to split the battery into two halves of the phone, making the battery itself just way smaller. And sadly, that's a consequence of that. Worse battery life. All right, so to round us off, I guess we're gonna talk about the software. The software on this phone, again, is pretty similar to any Android phone out there at this point. The only difference really is the way that Samsung disguises Android. And One UI 5.1 is still great. Of course, ever since the original One UI, they've been cutting down and slimming down the Samsung-y features. but at the same time, it's still the familiar form of One UI that we've all come to know and love and hate at the same time. It's One UI, and you do get a ton of features even if you're not going to use half of them. But with this folding display, you do get some really cool productivity and just extra functionality that you don't get on other foldables like the prematurely released Pixel Fold, and some features that, however much I would love in the OnePlus Open. I mean, this just doesn't have the same functionality that the Z Flip 5 and the Z Fold 5 have had for years and years. A very matured productivity machine here, especially in terms of just software. It's really optimized, especially for the folding display, as well as having excellent specs with pretty decent battery life at that. So what would be stopping you from buying the Z Flip 5? However great the Z Flip 5 might be, it's still a $1,000 folding phone that doesn't give you great battery life or great cameras. So unless you really want a folding phone that does this or that, I would recommend going somewhere else, simply because great battery and great cameras are such staple parts of phones now that not having a good battery or good cameras could just severely hinder your enjoyment and productivity when you use the phone. I mean, if you need to take photos and if the photo just comes out bad looking in low light, for a $1,000 phone, that's unacceptable at this point. And if your phone dies in 3 to 4 hours of you just using it for basic things such as social media and web browsing, it's just not a great look for Samsung. And while the specs on this phone are amazing, it doesn't really matter if you can't use it for that long. And I hope next year Samsung really steps up their battery game with this phone, especially because there's no point in stuffing the phone full of specs if you just can't use it. I also hope that they upgrade the cameras on this phone. They're serviceable, but especially in low light, the video and photo quality just suffers horrendously. So I want to end off this review by saying the Z Flip 5 is a great phone that folds. It's one of the best phones that folds. If you're trying to find a phone that folds, it's a great option, especially in a very limited market where we only really have the Moto Razrs to compare to. But if you go to an iPhone of similar price, or if you go to another Samsung phone of similar price, there are just way better options out there for less. That's my review. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.